Hello and welcome, I'm your CodeMonkey. In this lecture we're going to set up post-processing. Now here let me make a quick note. Usually when making your games you probably don't want to handle post-processing right away. You should first get an ugly prototype up and working before you worrying about any visuals. So normally I would only add post-processing much later on in the dev process. But since this is a course in video format, in order for the video to look a bit more appealing, let's set up post-processing right away. Now we already have the project set up to use URP, so adding post-processing is actually super simple. It's actually already added by default. First, before we do that, let's rename our scene with a proper name. So inside the scenes folder, it starts off with sample scene. This will be our main game scene, so let's just rename this to game scene. Okay, and now here on the hierarchy, we can see by default, this scene already contains a global volume game object. This is how you actually add post-processing. And by default, you can see that it also already has a sample profile attached. This is how you add all of the various effects. You can click on this link and it will show it over here on the project window. Now let's build this from scratch instead of starting from this one. So let's go into that file, into that asset and just delete it. Okay, so now we have no volume profile. Now let's go ahead and click on new to create a brand new one. Okay, so now here we can add overrides, add all of the effects that we want. Let's drag some visual meshes that we imported in the last lecture to get a better look at all of these effects and what they do. So first let's make some kind of floor. So let's make a 3D object. Let's make it a plane. Let's name this the floor. Also, one extremely important thing, whenever you create a brand new object, always check the object's transform position. By default, when you create an object, it appears in front of the scene camera, which will probably not be on 000. You always want to be very careful with the position of your actual objects. So for a plane, we do want this to be on the origin, so on 000. So make sure you always do that. Then let's scale it up a bit. So on the scale, let's put it on 555. Which, by the way, you've got this nice little icon. This was added in a recent Unity version. Basically, if you enable this, then it matches all of these values. So if you just change one of them, it changes all of them. So let's put this on 5. Okay, great. Now for the visual, let's go ahead into the mesh render on the materials, and let's select the brand new material. So let's click on the circle icon. And over here, let's find the floor material. So here it is. It's the one included in the assets. So there you go, we've got a nice basic floor material. Now let's also drag the player visual, so let's go inside the assets folder, and over here let's go inside the prefabs visuals, and down here we find the player visual, so let's just go ahead and drag this one. So there it is, a nice player visual. Let's also drag a counter, so let's find, let's say the clear counter. Let's drag this one. Let's rotate it to face the camera, something like this. And let's also put a cutting counter. Again, we're just placing some visuals just so we can see what the post-processing will do. And let's also place a bunch more things. So let's say a tomato. Let's place a tomato over there. And maybe a cabbage all the way over here. Okay, so we've got a handful of nice visual elements so we can test out our post-processing. By the way, here's a quick Unity tip on scene controls. Whenever you are on the scene view, which make sure you're on scene view and not game view, those are different. So on the scene view, you can move the camera with a mouse. You can pan with mouse 3, so the middle mouse button. So hold that and pan it around. You can rotate with the right mouse button. You can rotate around the point by holding down left alt and left click and just drag it around. To rotate around an object, you can select an object, like for example the player visual. Then you can press on F to select that object. And now if you hold Alt and click, it will rotate around that object. Also another method is you can hold the right mouse button to move it around, and then you can use WAS to move, so D, A, and so on. Then you can even press Shift to move in faster. And you can use the scroll wheel whilst holding down the right mouse button in order to modify the speed at which you move. So there are plenty of camera controls to really get you seeing exactly what you want to see. Now for another quick Unity tip, you can move the scene camera to where you want the game camera to be. So let's say I want the game camera to see things from about this angle. So you just position the scene camera. Then on the hierarchy, select the camera game object, so the main camera right here. And with that object selected, you press Ctrl, Shift, and F. And if there you go, you can see over here on the camera preview that it positioned the main camera looking on the exact same position at the exact same direction as the scene camera. So that's the shortcut Ctrl, Shift, F, or alternatively go up into game object and over here align with view. Now if you look, here is the scene view, and over here we've got the nice camera view. So just position the camera somewhere where we can view all of the assets. Now with this, let's add some post-processing effects. So first, let's select the global volume game object, and over here we can add all of our effect overrides. First up, let's begin by adding tone mapping. So there you go, we've got the effect, and over here we've got a nice little checkbox, so you can enable it in order to enable this effect and set one of the options. Now for this one, I'm not too familiar with color correction, but I find that usually adding a neutral tone map, usually that helps. Also make sure you're looking at the game view and not the scene view. If you're looking at the game view and you enable and disable this effect, you should see a difference. Whereas on the scene view, if you enable and disable, it doesn't actually show that. Even if on the scene view over here you have all the effects enabled, even with that, some effects for some reason don't show up on the scene view. So when playing around these effects, always make sure you're looking through the game view. So like I said, you should be able to toggle this and see a visual difference on the game view. If you don't, then make sure the camera has post-processing enabled. So let's select the main camera game object, and down here there's a toggle for post-processing. Make sure this one is enabled. And then also on the render pipeline assets, so let's find that one on the project window. Over here we've got the settings and you've got the URP high fidelity. This one should be using a renderer, so if you click on the renderer, over here you should have post-processing enabled. Again, all of this should already be correctly set up by default. So if you go into global volume and enable or disable, you should see a visual difference. Okay, so next effect, one that I always like to add is a bit of saturation. So let's add an override, post-processing, and let's add a brand new, here it is, color adjustments. Then over here, you've got plenty of things to play around with. For me, I like to add a bit of saturation, so just lift it up a little bit. Let's say just about 20. And I also like to add a little bit of contrast. So over here, let's also add 20. And there you go, it makes the colors pop a little bit more, so personally I like this effect. Then later on we're going to have some glowing objects, for example the stove. Let's actually try dragging that into the scene, so let's go into scene view, and in the assets let's find the stove counter, so here it is. And inside the stove counter there are some things, so here it is, the stove on visual. This one is disabled by default, so on the inspector let's just enable this game object to make it visible. Again, don't worry about the positioning of the objects on the scene view right now. We're only positioning them just to set up the post-processing. We're going to delete them all at the end of this lecture. Okay, so that one enabled. Let's go into the game view, and over here we see the stove enabled. So now let's go into the global volume. Let's add an override, go into post-processing, let's add a bloom effect. So right now, notice how that one is not glowing red hot. For that to work, we need to have bloom, and we need to enable the threshold and the intensity. If we raise the intensity, we do see, yep, there we go, a really nice glow there. By the way, here's a quick visual tip. If you want to make your game feel a bit more ethereal and magical, one good way is to put the threshold at a low value, below 1, so something like 0.5, and then put the intensity as a little bit. And with this, notice how everything has a slight glow, even colors that don't have any extra intensity. So the floor is glowing, the character is glowing, so everything looks quite a bit ethereal. This is a bit extreme, but it is an interesting effect. Also, another quick note here, in case you're not seeing anything change, make sure you go into the render pipeline assets, so the URP high fidelity, and over here make sure AGR is enabled. You can look at the stove glow if I disable it. Yep, that one stops glowing, and with that enabled, it does start glowing. AGR stands for High Dynamic Range, so that is how you can have a color go with an intensity above 1, which actually makes it glow when you have the bloom post-processing. If even with that you're still seeing issues, then make sure you go into the renderer, and over here for the post-processing, sometimes Unity has a weird bug and doesn't generate this post-process data file. So if that does happen, just go ahead, untoggle and toggle this, and it should work. And finally, like I said, on the camera, make sure you have post-processing enabled. So with all of that, you should be able to see the game view glow. Okay, back into our effects. With our bloom working, like I said, you can lower this below 1 to get a nice ethereal look, but this is a bit too intense on what we want, so let's make it a bit more subtle. So on the threshold, let's put it at 0.95. So there's a slight glow on the white parts, but nothing too intense. And for the intensity, let's put it at a regular 1. Okay, so I think that's a nice amount of bloom. All the colors glow a little bit, and we can see over there the stove, it is indeed glowing. Okay, great. Now, if you ever forget all of these steps and you can't get your project to glow, I made a nice video with a nice checklist of everything needed for Unity to glow. Definitely go ahead and watch that video whenever you have issues. Then for another fun effect, we have Vignette. So let's go into Add Override, Post-Processing, and let's find the Vignette. What this one does is adds a bit of darkness to the colors. So if we enable the intensity and we increase it, you can see what it does. So it adds darkness right on the corners there. Personally, I find this one looks good when it's quite a bit subtle. So let's put the intensity at something like 0.25. And then for the smoothness, let's also put it on 0.4. So just like that, just a slight darkness on the edges. So personally, I think it looks pretty good. And that's pretty much it for the post-processing on the volume component. I like how this looks. You can see the difference with the volume enabled or disabled. Quite a big difference. Looks pretty nice. But again, these are just visuals, so feel free to play around, maybe add some more effects, use some different settings. These are just visuals. They don't impact the game logic at all, so feel free to make it work exactly as you want it. Then yet another thing related to post-processing but not in this component is some anti-aliasing. For that, one place where you can change it is on the main camera. Over here you see a field for post-processing and you have a bunch of types. So FXAA or SMAA. Or if you want some more higher end post-processing, you can go into the render pipeline assets, so URP high fidelity, and over here we see anti-aliasing MSAA. This one is a bit more expensive, but looks a bit better. If you want to see the difference, you can go over here into the game view, and on the slider up top on the scale, you can increase this quite a bit. So with this, we can now see the pixelation, and you can see over here if I switch anti-aliasing from 4x back into disable, you can see lots of jagged edges. And if I put it on 2x, yep, looks a bit more smooth, 4x a bit more smooth, and 8x even more smooth. So with that, you can see the difference on all the edges, all the things. By default, this renderer has on 4x and nothing on the camera. This already looks pretty good, but to make the video look even better, I'm going to put it on 8x. And on the main camera, I'm also going to leave it with no anti-aliasing. You can combine them, but if you do, then everything looks a bit too blurry, so I don't quite like that effect. So put this one on none and the other one on 8x. Although, again, this is just a visual, so if you have a low-end PC, feel free to go into the URP, and over here, disable anti-aliasing. So the game looks a bit worse, but it will run much better. Okay, let's drag the scale back down, okay. Now, one final thing we can add is some really nice screen space ambient occlusion. For that, let's go into the renderer, so not the render pipeline asset, the renderer. And over here, by default, it already added screen space ambient occlusion. If it didn't add, you can click on add renderer feature, and over here, you won't be able to see it. I don't see it because I already have it. Okay, so here it is. Basically, what this effect does is it adds some tiny shadows where geometry intersects. If we enable and disable it quickly, we can see the effect over there on the counters. So you can see with the default effects, it already works quite nicely. For example, look at that on the player. We can barely see the difference between the head and the body, but if we enable this, it adds that nice little shadow. I think it looks really nice. But then we've got a bunch of settings we can play around, increase the intensity, the radius, and so on. Now, one important thing when setting all of these effects is to remember the point of view of the camera. In this case, we're making a top-down game. So before we play around with these settings, let's actually position the camera in a correct position. So let's go ahead, select the main camera, and let's position it above pointing down. So let's put it on an X of 0, on a Y of 21.5, on a Z of minus 21.3, then for the rotation on the X 46, then 0 and 0. And finally on the camera over here on the field of view, instead of 60, that's really wide. For this game, let's go with 20. Okay, so this is the view that we're going to use for our game. Let me just rotate the objects so they actually face the camera. So on the hierarchy, let's just select all the objects. Let's rotate them all around and just position them. Again, we're only using these just to see what they'll look like. We're going to delete all of these objects in a bit. Okay, so yep, that's the game view. Now that we have the camera set up, let's work on the settings for the ambient occlusion. So let's go down, select the renderer, and over here for the settings, for the intensity, let's put it on 4. For the radius, let's put it at 0.3, and direct lighting strength, let's put it all the way up to 1. Okay, so you can toggle this, enable and disable to see the difference, and yep, I do think these settings look pretty good. Finally, the last thing we need to check is the lighting window. So let's go into window, then down into rendering, and let's go into lighting. Out pops up the lighting window. Personally, I like to anchor it over there next to the inspector. And over here, we're really going to leave everything on defaults. So you can leave it as the lighting settings assets and nothing assigned. And then on the environment tab, over here, again, all of the defaults, I didn't touch any of these. So we've got environment lighting from the skybox, intensity multiplier of 1. So everything pretty much on defaults. Although again, like I said, most of these visual effects are very much personal preference. So if you want to make your game look a bit different than mine, then go ahead. You can play around with lighting over here. You can change skybox to gradient, color, and so on. If you want, you can use some baked lighting. Then if you want, you can add all kinds of extra effects. And also, by the way, remember that the effects are stored on this profile over here. So for example, you can click over here on the clone button and it will clone the effect. So let's click on it to find it. Yep, there you go. So that's the one that I built and here's a clone one. So if you want, you can make a clone one and then make it look very different. For example, let's go into chromatic aberration, make it really intense. And for example, let's go into the color curves. And over here, for some reason, let's drag the green up and so on. So there you go, completely different visual. So if you want, play around, make some weird effects. And if you want to go back, just revert back into the original profile. Personally, I'm quite happy with how this looks, so I'm going to be using this one, okay? Again, you can enable and disable the volume game object to see quite the big difference that post-processing makes. If you ever want to make your game look quite a lot better, always make sure to add some post-processing. Alright, so like I said, this looks really good. I like it. Now, before we go to the next lecture, let's just clean this up. So let's get rid of all of these objects. So the counter, cabbage, tomato, and so on. Let's get rid of all of them except the floor. So let's leave the floor and get rid of all of these. Alright, so here we have our nice empty scene. Let's just save our scene and let's get ready for the next lecture. Hi there, this is a quick intermission. So how are you doing? Are you enjoying the course so far? Are you having any trouble with anything? Is there something you didn't understand? If so, remember I'm always active in the comments answering all the questions. So if there's anything you need some extra clarification, go ahead and ask and I'll do my best to help. Also remember to check out the pinned comment. YouTube videos cannot be updated, so for any notes or comments, I'll put them in the pinned comment. And definitely check out the website page for this course. As people ask more and more questions, I will keep that page updated with any frequently asked questions for every single lecture, so that way you can see what others have asked and learn from them. And you can also download the project files for each lecture, so keep that page open on a second tab and check it every time you start watching a new lecture. I really hope you're enjoying the course, and I hope you've already learned quite a few things. Go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Okay, so let's go to the next lecture.